Well, I would have loved to have been there with you. It seems like it has been such a long time. In fact, I think it's pre-COVID since I was in Perth, and I was hoping to talk a little bit about the work that we had done in Perth in terms of visioning and so on. So it'll be good to reflect on some of that, because you guys have, I think, been really effective in showing leadership in a whole lot of important areas, particularly in the water sector. And you've been on a pretty amazing journey in the last few years and having some real successes. So really nice to join you today to talk about the importance of creating a vision. And you'd be happy to know I don't really want to spend 30 minutes just talking about vision in itself. I really want to talk about vision as a foundation for enabling change to happen. So I sort of plan to meander around a little bit, but I guess I want to talk about vision from the perspective that you've talked about it in the flyer for the conference. In that vision is really important for giving us a shared sense of where we're trying to get to, as Shelley said, a green and water sensitive Perth and Peel. And it has this role in aligning or orienting the efforts of multiple actors to a common goal or purpose. And so you've said that in the flyer, relying on all levels of governance, governments, organisations, individuals working together, getting a common understanding of what a green, blue Perth and Peel looks like, but also this aspect of exploring the issues associated with delivery, how we can work together to deliver that. So I sort of think of vision, having a vision. So that's about describing our destination, if you like. Where are we trying to get to? But the process of developing a vision is this thing that we might call envisioning or visioning. Who do we involve in that? Can the process of involving people in developing the vision itself be an enabler of collaboration and collective action? So the process of developing a vision is an important one. It becomes an end in itself to help drive change. And also being visionary, I guess, is worth thinking about in the scope of how a vision helps us to be visionary, because the visionary is about embodying those qualities and those actions that are going to enable us to deliver on that vision. So I thought I would start perhaps with some quick research insights that might help highlight the importance of vision in guiding system change, and then maybe try and touch on an example of visioning being employed as a core element of practice change or system transformation, including where there has been failure of reform or system change. And I've got a very Victorian example of that, because I think that really highlights how we sometimes really underestimate the complexity of system change, and therefore we struggle to navigate change. And I'd also like to highlight that it's interesting. There isn't a lot of the research into sustainability transitions, system transformation, has not necessarily generated a lot of tools and frameworks that can help guide us in those sort of changes. But it has been something that the CRC has been very much involved in, and particularly here in Perth, because we develop some tools and frameworks that can be of assistance in navigating system change, particularly from research here in Perth, and they have been used to guide Perth's transition to a vision for a water-sensitive or water-wise Perth. And I know many of you are here today are familiar with some of those transition tools already. And I come from a practice background, so I sort of understand the importance of research in generating an understanding of system change, but I guess I'm really interested in what we can learn from practice as well as from the research background. So, and I've worked in water reform all of my career, essentially. So my interest has been in this area of system transformation. And most of my focus on practice change is related to environment and sustainability. I started life as a botanist and landscape ecologist, essentially. And some of that career has been in the sort of policy and planning roles in water and environment departments of government, but most of it's actually been in strategy and operational roles in organisations like Melbourne Water and Melbourne Parks and Waterways. And 25 years ago, I championed a transformation in stormwater management from practice dominated by drainage engineering to water-sensitive urban design, borrowing the concept of water-sensitive urban design from WA and transplanting it into Melbourne and Victoria. But through that process, I really learned to appreciate the importance of understanding governance and understanding the value of research knowledge related to system change. And that's now a lot of my focus at Monash University, working with Bryony Rogers, who has helped to develop this presentation as well. So that transformation of stormwater management practice to water-sensitive urban design is but one important change that we've been going through and rethinking the way that we plan and manage urban places. There's many other areas of practice that are embedded in the way that we plan and manage cities, and many of them are no longer sustainable in a world that's facing climate, population and biodiversity crises of the sort that I think you were talking about, Shelley, earlier. So the need for change is becoming more and more urgent, but we're operating in a really complex environment where the way forward's uncertain and the impact of our actions are difficult to predict. And I guess this is why system transformation, sustainability transitions became a bit of a focus of the CRC research. And you can see this water sensitive city transitions framework here that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But as we move through these transitions, through these city states, things become more complex. You can't see my presentation. Shelley's just texted me. Interesting. I am definitely working through one. I've got it in front of me. I just assumed you could see it. So you're just looking at my face, are you? Oh, okay. Dear me. All right, that's a bit embarrassing. Let me just get out of here, and I know what's happening. I just didn't share screen, did I? All good? There we go. Right. My apologies. So I think what I was saying is that the CRC for water sensitive cities, of course, which ended in 2021, but Monash Sustainable Development Institute and Water Sensitive Cities Australia are sort of still trying to build on that research knowledge and implement many of the practice changes that are important to this idea of water sensitive cities. And you're very, very much on that pathway here as well. But a key goal of the CRC research was how to enable the acceleration to more water sensitive practices, and recognising that we're sort of moving from simpler systems, and this applies to many of the sort of ways we manage cities, whether it's transport, energy, whatever. We're moving from fairly linear ways of planning and managing systems to much more complicated systems, which requires collaboration across sectors, and it becomes much more difficult to align the actions of many actors to establish those cross-sector collaborations and to be able to predict the impact of our actions. So we can do planning, but it can be very uncertain what the outcome of planning and our actions can be. And, you know, this is one of Bryony's favourite slides, I guess, to highlight some of those, that sort of difference between complicated and complex systems. The classic example, of course, is, you know, building a jet airliner. Obviously very complicated, but it's something that you can map out and plan for, put in spreadsheets from start to finish, and you can be pretty confident that if you've covered all of the detail, you will end up with a functioning airliner at the end of that, regardless of perhaps the context in which you are operating. But for example, bringing up a child is much more complex. You can't, you know, every context is different. We can't predict how our actions and ways of interacting will ultimately affect, you know, what that person becomes. So this has become a real focus of research, and of course there's so much frustration with the lack of progress on climate change and mitigating emissions around the world, making progress on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a particular focus of MSDI, that there's much more research effort being concentrated in this area at the moment. And this is highlighting the importance of vision as well, this sort of research. And I thought I'd bring up this diagram from a paper from Cameron Allen and Shirin Malakpour, who are both at Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And it can, you know, give you the reference for this very recent paper in 2023. But it's basically, you know, a model for sustainability transitions. And it sort of highlights that these sort of system transitions can take many pathways. They involve different actors. These actors can have different levels of agency. They're trying to enable and navigate change. And an ideal type transition or transformation can be thought of as these two S-shaped curves, you know, corresponding to the growth of a new sustainable system, which has these phases of emergence, acceleration, and stabilisation. And then simultaneously, there's this decline in the unsustainable system, starting with destabilisation phase, moving into a breakdown phase where change has been navigated, and finally into a phase-out part of transformation where a new or modified system is being stabilised or embedded. So there are various enablers and barriers to transformation across these different phases. So, and, you know, for example, enabling conditions in the emergence phase where, you know, change is often incremental, it can be quite hard to detect. It's where experimentation is taking place. There are new problem definitions that are emerging that are creating awareness of the need for change. Organisational cultures that encourage collaboration are important. Innovation and learning is really important in this phase. Leaders who can build trust, form coalitions, and communicate compelling narratives, and networks of innovation and change agents or policy entrepreneurs. And you can see how vision would underpin much of that, the creation of a compelling narrative, the creating connections between different organisations. And the sort of barriers that you encounter are almost the reverse of those, I guess, in this sort of emergence phase. So there's the lack of proven results, the scepticism, therefore, from the embedded in those embedded ways of thinking and doing. The fear of change, the social norms, again, those embedded ways of thinking and doing. Disinformation, so a deliberate undermining of advocates for change. There's just this lack of agreement, regulation that impedes progress or system change, the lack of enabling regulation and guidelines, inconsistent policy, risk adversity, and then absence of leadership, lack of trust and collaboration, deficits of agency and power imbalances. So there's it's a long list of those sorts of barriers, but fundamental to this sort of change are the well-functioning relationships that are sort of strengthened through all of these phases of transformation, as is a shared vision and leadership that enables cross-sector networks, builds trust, collaborates with others, generates and shares knowledge, manages conflict in order to prepare the system for change and to navigate the transition and chart new direction. And this is, I guess, why you're coming together. You want to create a system change, you want to be able to chart a new direction and navigate change, and a foundation for that process is vision. And this is another model that you may have seen before, but I find particularly useful and quite powerful as well. But we sometimes start with trying to drive system change because we want to change practice. So we tend to focus on the top level of that triangle. But it can be very hard to, even if we succeed in tweaking policy, for policy to drive the changes needed, unless we've actually dealt with what sits below that line. So a vision is fundamental for starting a process to challenge existing ways of thinking and existing ways of doing. Setting up a way of looking at mental models and saying, oh, are those ways that we think about these issues actually appropriate? Are they going to support us being able to deliver this, deliver on our shared goals that we've defined through our mission, through our vision? And are these ways of thinking and doing embedded in particular power dynamics, sitting with institutions that run process that just constrains our ability to change and do things differently? And ultimately, we need to change resource flows, practices and policies to get the outcomes that we're after. But we need to think about these underpinnings, and vision is so important for doing that. I'd just like to explore a water sector example, or two water sector examples from here in Victoria that have tried to drive a system change from a business as usual approach to water management to an integrated water management approach. And one which has really encountered system barriers that cause system breakdown, backlash and path, and we're observing sort of path dependent lock-in. And no doubt these are all the sorts of things that you're familiar with, you've encountered in wanting to transition Perth to a water sensitive city or a water wise city, and the sorts of things that you'll be encountering in thinking about how Perth, a greening strategy for Perth, a vision for a green blue Perth and Peel in the future. So an example. And this one goes back to around 2010 or so on, the height of the millennium drought, throwing up many challenges to business as usual water management in many parts of Australia. And ultimately, the Labor government's decision to build a desalination plant and a north-south pipeline to tap into regional water supplies from north of the divide. This created huge controversy. There was no sort of socialisation of this decision with the broader community. There wasn't really a social licence to do it, and it became a very political issue, and it was capitalised on by the then coalition in opposition, who came forth with an alternative water policy. And they really talked about a living Melbourne, living Victoria, water policy. And this is a media release that came through just after the coalition won the election, and a substantial part of their victory was attributed to this alternative water policy. So they accused the previous Labor government of wasting billions of dollars on unnecessary and expensive infrastructure, being desal plant and so on. And they wanted to completely transform this business as usual approach to water planning and management by embedding water efficiency and focusing on local solutions rather than large-scale infrastructure. And they set up a ministerial advisory committee as an alternative, a source of advice. So they basically shut out most of the embedded influences within water policy and brought in new people to advise the government, who made the recommendations to set up an Office of Living Victoria. So a new institution, essentially, as an alternative centre for driving reform in water policy and practice, particularly around integrated water cycle management. So this is a way of protecting and improving urban livability, particularly regarding greening, cooling, improving amenity, and so on. And you can see at the core of this here is a vision. And they've produced off the back of this vision and those objectives, which I hope you can read on your screen there, an ambitious reform agenda, which was transformational in its ambition. But the OLV set itself up as being outside the normal delivery processes. It was the creator of this vision. It was an independent office under the Minister for Water. It was there to focus on addressing the barriers and creating more enabling conditions to support this transition or transformation to IWM. But ultimately, it struggled with that role. The policy entrepreneurs that had influenced the coalition water policy and then ultimately led the Office of Living Victoria and these reforms, they had the vision, but they didn't mobilise and harness behind this vision the capabilities of other sector actors to the reform enterprise, or create a network of capable institutional champions to advance that IWM agenda. So OLV had a vision, but it really lacked the visionaries, if you like, or the capabilities. It failed to embody the qualities and the actions that were needed to inspire and drive change. And so I guess the question is, why is that? And this was the subject of a recent paper to Ozwater, which again, I can share you the link to that paper, or send the paper around to you if you are interested. But it came down to the Office of Living Victoria being established with this tension around whether it was going to be an agency for shaking up and disrupting, or collaborating and consulting. And ultimately, it opted for this more revolutionary and confrontational strategy. And its whole authority was sort of based on a blend of political mandate and superior technical and business cases for what they were proposing. And they did have a very strong political mandate, and they did have a very strong social licence, because the community was not happy with those decisions of the previous government. They had very heavy ministerial backing, but their superior business and technical case really proved to be quite elusive without the involvement and support of respected practitioners and researchers. So the OLV itself tried to become a centre of expertise, and there became distrust and poor relations between the OLV and other government entities in the urban water space, and this contributed then to OLV's reform agenda never really gaining credibility and momentum. And then ultimately, the coalition lost the 2014 election. They were a rare one-term government, and the subsequent Labor government abolished the Office of Living Victoria. So you could take this as an example of backlash against a transformational process here, an attempt to transition a system across to integrated water management. But off the back of this, amongst the sort of disruption that was caused by OLV, the Labor government itself recognised the need to address and start to enable this transition itself. And it began crafting a new water policy. And this ultimately included their Integrated Water Management Framework Victoria, which was designed to address those challenges associated with integrated planning across the water cycle, the different elements of the water cycle, and to harness the involvement of multiple agencies with strong linkages to different elements of urban water planning and management, including local government, the water corporations, waterway managers, catchment management authorities, and the planning authorities, and also traditional owner groups. So at the core of this was the establishment of integrated water management forums. So these were collaborative forums to address that inter-organisational collaboration seen as essential to delivering IWM. The forums were designed to engage high-level leadership, the CEOs, essentially, of local government, MDs of the water corporations, engage that high-level leadership to work collectively on a vision that stakeholders and their communities, for example, the communities of the individual local governments, could share for the future. So this is co-development of the vision. Look at the specific livability and resilience outcomes connected to that vision that IWM could aim to achieve. So goals around urban greening, managing flood risk, water security and affordability, health of waterways. All of those things form part of the goals and part of the vision for the IWM forums. And they also then identify the sort of strategies and projects that require inter-organisational collaboration to achieve those outcomes. So jointly working on activities and initiatives, and also jointly identifying the policy and regulatory reforms that might be needed to enable the delivery of those strategies and those projects. So there's been 15 of those forums set up across Victoria. Most of the attention's been focused on 5 metropolitan forums, one of which I chair, which is the forum for the Yarra catchment. They've all developed targets and measures related to what has become the 7 goals, 7 strategic goals aligned with each of their vision for the region. They've then gone on to set up measures and targets for all of those 7 goals. And they're consistent across those forum areas, but they've all been driven particularly by the stakeholders. So individual forums have set their own targets, considering their local context, opportunities and aspirations. And most recently, each of the forums has completed a implementation action plan that was launched by the Minister just a few weeks ago, in fact. So all of that work has been led by those forums. They have working groups made up of individuals from those different organisations. It's facilitated centrally by the Department of Environment, Energy, Climate Action, the old Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And they've also then put in a monitoring and evaluation framework. So the forums are now sort of tracking their progress. So they have resulted in this greater collaboration. More than 100 different organisations have been involved across those 15 forum areas. They've all collectively developed a greater understanding of integrated water management's role in creating livable and resilient cities. The forum projects have attracted around $200 million in federal and state and local funding, focused on creating livable and resilient cities and towns. So, and they've also looked at some of the governance barriers to IWM that need to be solved collaboratively. So the process has been evolutionary, essentially, with trust in the collaboration being built and driven over time by the forum members. So I guess there's lessons in both of these case studies that link back to how vision has been used to try and drive change, but in fundamentally different ways. A sort of a top-down, more technocratic way of developing and trying to drive the delivery of vision, and a more bottom-up and collaborative way of developing and delivering vision. There are strengths in the OLV approach. It had a very clear change agenda in response to the crisis of the Millennium Drought. It had, open and strong political support, commitment of resources, a willingness to tackle barriers, with that sort of strong ministerial backing to disrupt, if you like, the power balances and so on. But ultimately, you can't really describe the legacy of the OLV as being, really a decisive step in the transition to IWM. The IWM program, on the other hand, has really slowly developed the collaborative networks, developed the targets themselves. The investment plans are based on transparent planning and assessment processes. The open timeframes and more flexible approach have been shaped by the collaboration and added to those sort of enabling conditions. But, part of the problem, I guess, is those long timeframes also represent risks to the program's success. And the IWM framework is really yet to demonstrate the acceleration phase there. It's sort of at the bottom of that acceleration curve at the moment, shifting from planning to implementation. So these are examples, I guess, of dealing with the sort of complex system change that, you've been tackling yourselves in terms of shaping Perth as a water-sensitive city or a water-wise city, and, no doubt anticipate encountering in, a greening of Perth as well. So I think we can draw on both the research and the practical experience from these sort of examples to better understand how we can guide and navigate these sort of transitions. So just reiterating, I guess, complex rather than complicated. We cannot command and control. There are too many uncertainties and surprises, but we can steer direction and pace of change. And vision enables us to align around the direction of change. It enables the organisations that need to collaborate to be able to self-organise and respond to conditions and to find the leverage points that are of particular importance, I guess, for starting to create those tipping points, if you like, in enabling the transition. We have to be really sensitive to the emergence of new conditions and the way our actions are impacting the response to those actions, and to adapt as we make progress. So relationships are really at the centre of creating these enabling conditions, and vision is just so important as a foundation, I think, for those relationships. So I see the purpose of visioning. It is about imagining the future. So it's about helping us to understand where we're wanting to get to. But I think it prompts us to ask this question around how we are going to get there. And when we're asking that question, where are we trying to get to and how are we going to get there, we start to, I think, hopefully focus in on where are those barriers and what are the enabling conditions that we need to create. And there's still a little bit of time left, I think, Shelley, and I thought it might be helpful to touch on, the framework that the CRC developed for navigating transition, which has as its basis vision, which many of you are going to be familiar with, but was, developed through the research in Perth and has really been adopted, and I guess a great example of what we're talking about, aligning around a vision, co-evolution, self-organisation is the Water Sensitive Perth Transitions Network. which is a sort of an informal structure of collaborators and champions, which has been endorsed, if you like, by the authorising environment, but has basically emerged from what started in Perth, as a visioning process. And the CRC really used that interest and that willingness and that aspiration from many of the stakeholders in Perth to then bring some of the research knowledge in and start to trial the development of some tools and frameworks that could help guide and navigate the transition. So I don't know whether everyone in the room is familiar with. I know people like Giles and so on have been through all this, but these sort of tools, and I said before, there's been a lot of recent research focusing on sustainability transitions, but there hasn't been a lot of translation of that knowledge into tools and frameworks. This is one of the few examples where some of that research knowledge has been translated into tools and frameworks, and this framework, while it came out of the water space, is quite adaptable to quite different context and quite different set of goals and aspirations, including ones around, city greening, for example. So I might just very quickly run through it so you get a bit of a sense of what a framework might look like and how you could use some of this thinking to back up your visioning process to really then start to ask those questions, because I know day two of your conference is then more about how to get there. So I hope I'm not, gazumping any of the work that you're going to do tomorrow. But this is, we've got all of these barriers, but there are also the enablers. And the focus of the CRC research is how do you create the enabling conditions for change to counter those barriers? Champions, platforms for connecting knowledge projects, tools and guidance, and so on. If I run through each of those, what you can see is that champions are absolutely important for driving change. But as you mature through a transition, champions might be initially individual activists. They become more empowered as champions. They become more connected, potentially across sectors, and more powerful in their advocacy and more influential. Champions can often become then more embedded in organisations and rise to more senior positions in organisations. And so agencies themselves, institutions themselves become champions, and then institutions across sectors become champions for a common vision. And this becomes very powerful. Platforms for connection are so important to facilitating that sort of process as well. Initially sharing concerns and ideas, developing collective voice, building broad support, but then helping to spread the sort of knowledge and expanding a community of practice, the practitioners who are now going to deliver these new ways of doing things, and then ultimately guiding consistent application. And of course, organisations like AILA, Stormwater Victoria, are platforms for connecting. The Transitions Network is a platform for connecting. There are all sorts of ways of creating platform for connecting. Your conference today is a platform for connecting. Knowledge is so important if we're trying to drive practice change. Initially, knowledge of why something is an issue. What is the need for change? What are the causes and impacts of those issues? What are the sorts of solutions that we can employ now to address those issues? How do we then advance those solutions and start to mainstream those sorts of solutions, build capacity across practitioners and institutions that are going to have to deliver those sorts of solutions? And then ultimately, when they're becoming more mainstream, how do we monitor and evaluate and learn from and improve and continue to refine? And then projects are such an important part, again, of delivering this sort of change. So projects that might investigate issues, might investigate solutions, research into new technologies and ways of doing things, then starting to employ those solutions and learn from the employment of those solutions, scaling them up, then starting to mainstream through widespread implementation and learning and standardisation and refinement. And Oh, didn't realise that one was animated. And then ultimately, the tools and guidance. Often we start in this place where it's actually somewhere where we should work more to the end. And I realise I'm running out of time, Shelley, and I'm just about finished. The tools and guidance, both the technical and the administrative. So the administrative are really the instruments that are going to embed the practice change, essentially, and the technical tools are the ones that are going to ensure that we deliver the practice change appropriately, and it becomes, standardised and a comprehensive approach to things. So that is essentially, I guess, there's a whole set of tools around how to do that, and that's been employed in Perth. It started in 2015, I think, 16 Perth, in 2015, 16 Perth, in Perth, Shelley, with the development of a vision. You can see the vision and transition strategy for Perth, which was developed through this sort of process over a number of years. The transition challenges that emerged from this process, and you can see top of the list, the compelling vision and narrative, the need to align organisations, organisational objectives, responsibilities and capacities, overcoming fragmentation, risk-averse cultures, the capacity, the social licence, if you like, from community. And I think one of the wonderful things about Perth is then it's consistently used these tools and it's re-evaluated and looked at the impact over time. And again, many of you will be familiar with the benchmarking of this vision represented by the blue there against that water sensitive cities transitions framework. The green dotted line is the benchmark, and blue is the 2021 re-benchmarking, the blue blob, with the dark blue dashed line representing the vision where you're trying to get to. So you can see it's a long-term transition, but the vision is a way of orienting, and the tools are a way of guiding and navigating the transition and tracking progress. And Perth is now the top scoring capital city based on that 2021 benchmark in Australia. So you can see, Sydney, the other star at the top there. Been over 80 cities using this sort of benchmarking process around the world now, but Perth in Australia is the outstanding capital city. So there's been, fantastic progress. Transformation is very slow, and it can be super frustrating. So that's pretty much it from me, Shelley. Sorry to go over time, and to sort of go beyond just talking about vision, but coming from that practitioner base, and there being somewhat of a gap in research around visioning and transition tools. I thought you're going to be engaged in this process. What is the destination? But having that conversation is then that opportunity to talk about whose vision is this? Who needs to be engaged in a vision to enable a transition to be undertaken by a broad collaboration? And how do we use a vision to understand what are the transition pathways? How are we going to get there ultimately? So I hope that is going to be helpful to you for the conversation that you're going to undertake for the rest of the afternoon and tomorrow. Thank you.